All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is part three, the final video in the chapter 4.3 series from Authoritarian States. Once again, this book, the final chapter dealing with the rise of the Nazis and Hitler and their regime in the 30s into the 1940s. So we're in the aims and results of Nazi policies chapter. We've had a video one, we've had a video two. This is now video three, and we're on page 220. Okay, let's get started. So we're talking again, we just finished talking in the previous video about women, and we talked about how women really couldn't be classified as a minority because they're usually half the population. But now we are actually going to talk about minorities, groups of people who are probably only 5%, 10%, perhaps even less than 5% of the population, and how the Nazis dealt with them. Okay, uh, so they use this word a lot in this chapter, asocial. Asocial. And that is defined as anyone who did not conform to desired social norms as defined by the Nazi regime. Okay, Social Outcasts in the Third Reich is a book written by this historian named Noakes, and he says it's a flexible term used to label anyone who they felt was undeserving of inclusion in the big V word there, the German word that means the German community. Okay, and then they have a big, even longer German word that starts with a G that means community aliens. So these are people who were like outside the normal society, right? Okay. And of course, why did they want to remove these people or separate them from the rest of German society? Well, they would argue that it was to keep the racially healthy community from such elements. They didn't want these people infecting the master race. Okay. So the first group they talk about on page 220 are beggars and the homeless. Okay. So we don't see a lot of this in Japan, especially where we live, but beggars are common in other countries. And at this time, especially after the Great Depression, these would be people who couldn't find work and with nothing else to turn to, they would just sit on the street, perhaps near train stations or busy areas, and just put their hand out or have a cup and ask for money. Do you have 10 yen? Do you have 5 yen? I mean, they weren't usually asking for much. Um, and they these people, again, sort of upset other people who find them, perhaps unsightly or even maybe dangerous if they were provoked. And so they often um, would be tracked and monitored by the uh, state police, etc., in the Nazi society. Um, so the homeless were often rounded up. Some of them were even taken to some of the infamous camps, such as Dachau. Sterilization was imposed on many. Now, again, we've talked about sterilization in a previous chapter where they do a medical procedure so that that person can't have babies. Whether it's a man or a woman, there's different procedures. Okay, so that's what that word means. Um, Beggars and homeless people were arrested, and many were detained in another famous concentration camp called Buchenwald. Um, they estimate that up to 10,000 people that were homeless were rounded up and put in these camps, and very few of them survived the war. What would they do at the camps? Well, they would often be worked to death, literally to death. They were given very uh, meager clothing, if anything, and Germany in the winter can be very harsh. They were given very little food and nourishment and just be made to work. I don't really know enough about the camps to know what kind of work, if it was industrial work, if it was work outside, like clearing wooded areas, etc., etc. But whatever it was, it obviously took its toll, and many of the people died from overwork, exhaustion, malnutrition, etc. Other than just being outright killed, which happened to many of them as well. Okay, this is not a fun part of the chapter. Let's just preface this now. We're going to talk about some very serious topics, including the Holocaust. So, we have to just, but this is history. This is what happened, and we need to talk about it, um, and compare what happened, say, in China or in Cuba when we get to those two chapters. All right, the next group would be homosexuals. It's not just something that was happening in Germany. Homosexuality was not allowed or even outlawed and illegal in many countries in Europe. Famously, I think one of you did The Imitation Game, the movie about Alan Turing and how he was a homosexual and was given a choice after he was caught in a homosexual act with another man of chemical castration, chemically taking away with drugs his ability to have children, or prison. And because he wanted to continue working, he decided to take the drugs, and that drove him insane, and he eventually committed suicide. So, uh, when we say homosexual in this context, we're talking about men who like other men and women who like other women. Um, So you can kind of read what happened to them. It's pretty, I don't think this is a difficult part to read. Um, Basically, one of the things it came down to was I don't think it was, well, religion often, the Christian religion especially, often preaches against homosexuality. But I think in this case, it was the fact that there was some little tiny bit of like, well, what's your job as a German citizen? A Nazi might ask. It's to be a good member of the state, to support Hitler and the regime, and if you're a young person, a man or a woman, to get a family and have babies. And of course, there are ways for homosexual couples to have children through adoption, through surrogacy, and other things. But at that time, it was seen like you are making a choice, even though I think most people would argue now that homosexuality is not a choice, you're born that way, but you're making a choice to not have children, right? To be in this relationship with a same-sex partner where you cannot naturally have babies. So that was probably the biggest thing that made the Nazis upset, not so much the fact that, men were kissing men or girls were kissing girls. Okay. Um, It says between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexuals were imprisoned, um, and that by 1939 they had identified 100,000 homosexuals. Maybe not all of them were taken off to camps. Um, and they, of course, got this famous emblem in the camps of a pink triangle. Okay, and that's now a symbol I think that's been adopted by the LGBTQ community as like a symbol of defiance, like, the pink triangle. Um, Now they were often, it says here, subject to the harshest treatment. Like I don't want to go too much into the specifics, but like you might have political dissidents, communists, then you might have Jews on the next, you know, like lower level, and then below them was the homosexuals, and they were beaten up and treated very harshly and stuff by the camp guards, by the SS troops, etc. Okay, so beggars and homeless, homosexuals. Next, a very small group, but one that's mentioned nonetheless, Jehovah's Witnesses. And I'm not going to explain how a Jehovah's Witness is different than another type of Christian. You should just Google it, look on the first, again, couple paragraphs on Wikipedia for a basic definition. But one of the things of their beliefs, their religious beliefs, is pacifism, right? That they shouldn't hurt other people and they shouldn't do military service. Okay. So they refused to use the Hitler greeting, Heil Hitler, and they would not join any of the National Socialist organizations. So right there, that's a huge middle finger, as it were, to the Nazis, and they were targeted. It says on page 222 at the top, they first banned the group. You just can't have a meeting of Jehovah's Witnesses starting in 1933, and about 2,000 of them ended up in concentration camps. Of that, about 1,200 died. Um, they had to wear purple triangles, and it tells you about the different triangles and who they denoted. Um, but they often stood by their principles and would not give in. Their pacifism allows no compromise. So they were not numerically a threat. There was very few of them, and um, they could not be tolerated, though, by the Nazis, no matter what, just because they often had the courage to speak out, or not even speak out, but just not join in. By not joining, they're making a statement, right? So they were targeted. Okay, then we get to biological outsiders in quotes. Okay, gypsies were often targeted. These are people that would be Eastern Europe at the time wasn't as well defined with countries as it is now in modern Europe. And so these people would be born in areas and maybe not feel like they actually belong to a certain country or another. And they would travel around in wagons and other things because, there weren't cars yet for the most part. Well, there were cars by 1930s, but gypsies generally didn't own one. And they would set up circuses and musical shows and cook food and live kind of a nomadic lifestyle. And so it says there were approximately 30,000 gypsies in Germany by 33. By 45, that number had gone down to just 5,000. So that means 25,000 were removed and sent probably to camps. Um, so they were classified as work-shy vagrants. They were people that A, weren't pure German by birth, and they were avoiding work, which was kind of a no-no. Well, not kind of, was a no-no under the regime because they didn't want to maybe have a steady job. They wanted to have this nomadic lifestyle, just pick up and go whenever they felt like it. Da, da, da. Okay. Then the next part about pure gypsies, you don't have to read that part. Uh, and of course, the Nazis would end up, spreading out from Germany, if you look at your map of Europe, excuse me, and taking over large parts of what we now call Eastern Europe, modern day Poland, Belarus, Czechoslovakia, which is now Czechia, etc., into Estonia, Lithuania, parts of Russia. And this is where the gypsies kind of, felt at home. So they really had nowhere to run away to when the Nazis started to take them away to camps, etc. Um, they went to camps that you've probably heard of, like Auschwitz and elsewhere. Some of them were used for medical experiments, which is devastating to hear. And up to 500,000, 500,000 were murdered in the camps. So it's a significant number, along with other numbers you're going to hear as we go through this chapter. Okay, so why are they called biological outsiders? Because they're European, but and they're even Eastern European. It's not like, they're black or they're you know, Latino or something, like from some faraway place. They're from just not too far away from Germany, but they racially did not look like Nordic Germans, and nor did they kind of trace their lineage back maybe to that type of place. Okay, then the last part, before we get to the Jewish population, is the mentally and physically handicapped. Again, the first word there on 222 is eugenics. So you need to make sure you understand what that was. Um, they wanted to use gene theory and DNA and things that they were discovering in science to maybe breed the perfect human. So, of course, you have to remove any human in the gene pool that might breed and have children that would have deficiencies. If you were born with any physical defects or mental, uh, you know, words, autism, retardation, and things like that. Uh, Part of that, like we talked about the other group the homosexuals who were maybe targeted because they weren't going to have children. This group was targeted because they they would be a burden to the state. You had to take care of them, you had to feed them, you had to house them, send them to school, use resources to take care of them because obviously they couldn't take care of themselves a lot of the time. But they got no they felt like the propaganda message was they got no return, and this is what this poster is about on page 223. Okay, this is the one we're talking about here, and it's basically saying this person, the person in the chair, suffering from hereditary diseases, cost the community 60,000 Reich marks during his lifetime, like to feed him and put him in a home and take care of him and hire people to take care of him. Fellow citizens, this is your money too. And so what they're trying to justify there is uh, killing him, is, uh, and there's a word for that. It's called euthanasia, putting a sick person to sleep or, killing them, usually with drugs, um, so their life doesn't go on. Now, usually when you hear about euthanasia, it's because the person is in severe pain and they're going to die anyway of a terminal disease, like a cancer patient who maybe has 3 months to live, but those 3 months are going to be just torturous hell, of um, just pain every day. So some people will say we should, let that person die with some dignity. And I'm getting a little emotional because I know somebody that this had to make this decision about somebody in their lives, and it was very rough. But a lot of doctors say we can't do that. We are doctors. We can't kill people. We have to heal people and help people. And there's a real argument, and you should look into it if you're interested, especially if you plan on going into medicine, about euthanasia and what is its role. Some countries are more like, it should be the decision of the person that's dying. Other people are like, no, we can't allow that to happen, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so they say that the two things at the top of 223 are again sterilization, taking away these people's ability to have children who would probably also be physically or mentally handicapped, and euthanasia. Um, so, in fact, in 1933, the Nazis actually passed a law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring. That's really, I mean, if you're talking and you want to write an essay about how invasive the authoritarian state in the Nazi regime was, that's a law that was passed that if your baby is born, with certain defects, when it gets old enough, we're going to take away its ability to ever have children. Um, that's that's really going into people's lives and making decisions for people that maybe the state shouldn't be allowed to make. And um, uh, yeah, just changing the course of people's lives. Um, so schizophrenia, magic depression, epilepsy, you can look up what some of these things are. But even things like chronic alcoholism, which we know some people who drink alcohol too much every day, day after day, it's something to do with their physical makeup as much as their mental. So it's not necessarily like just they're weak and they can't stop drinking. There's a physical reason for why they drink. So they carried out a lot. I mean, 320 to 350,000 sterilizations uh, during the 10 years of the Nazis really being in power. Um, so state euthanasia, again, it goes into that. They say about 72,000 deaths was officially halted in 1941 in a rare protest from not only regular people but the church. The church kind of said, "Hey, this is not, this is not the way we should be treating these children." So yeah, terrible, terrible way to look at people as, and this is the way the Nazi state looked at people. It's like, what can you contribute? If you can contribute, what should we do with you? Okay, should we send you away to a camp? Should we just make you leave Germany? Should we put you, should we work you to death? Should we just get rid of you and kill you? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. Okay. Then the last few pages are, other than the very last page, 227, are about the Jewish population and the Holocaust. I would like to take a few minutes in class and go over that because it is, uh, it's a big topic, and they give it one, two, three, about 3.5 pages here, and when you talk to normal people who are not history students in my class, because you guys are not normal anymore. You've been told the truth and the facts, and we've gone over a lot of things, a deep dive that other people don't know. But when you talk to a lot of people, when they think of Hitler, one of the first things they think of is how much he hated Jews, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. Um, and why he was such an evil, evil man. And that's one of the main reasons people bring up. So we need to, I think, understand it on a little bit better level. So we will go over page 223, 224. We'll talk about the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht and Frank, for an example. Um, and then the Holocaust itself, the quote unquote final solution, that happened from 41 to 45, and the big number that's often mentioned, 6 million Jewish people, not just from Germany, but from other places that the Nazis invaded and conquered, were systematically murdered in these death camps, and how that affected the population of Jews in Europe leads to the creation of a whole country, the Jewish homeland Israel. And you should know about that, I think, because it's still significant today. We're having in the world today a huge fight, in Gaza between Palestinians and Israelis over control of that area of the world. And that's a whole nother topic that, is kind of removed at this point from the Holocaust, but you can understand maybe some of the reasons that people are so passionate one way or the other about that topic when it gets discussed. And and you should know that the vast majority of the Jews that were killed, of the 6 million, um, I think I think it's less than 500,000 were actually German Jews, like Jews that were born in Germany, maybe had family going back multiple generations. Most of them were from other parts of Europe, especially Poland, for example. So we will talk about that. All right. So skipping ahead, and we'll do that in class on Wednesday. Skipping ahead to 227, we'll just do this last page. Because again, when you look at the mark scheme, no, the syllabus, I'm sorry, the syllabus for paper two for authoritarian states. The last bullet in the third section is, to what extent was authoritarian control achieved in whatever state you're looking at, Cuba, China, or Hitler's Germany. So that's this last page on 227. All right, drink here. National Socialism's destruction, okay, obviously they lost the war. I think you guys all know that, was the result of external forces. So the people inside Germany did not rise up. The people inside Germany did not say, we don't want any more of Hitler. Hitler tried to go out and conquer, I mean, in his mind, the world, but certainly Europe. And people pushed back, and eventually the Americans got involved in 1942 after Pearl Harbor at the end of 41. And the Nazis were defeated by the Allied forces, including the French and the British and the uh, Australians and the Canadians and many other people that helped, along with the Americans, helped in that effort. So 12 years of Nazi rule were ended by the outcome of the Second World War rather than by any significant internal opposition to the Nazi government. So that's interesting to think of it that way. Like, who knows if Hitler hadn't invaded Poland on that September day in 1939 and he had just sort of tried to enforce these policies and set up these camps inside Germany, and who knows how long he could have kept going. Francisco Franco is one that I point to. He took over Spain after the Spanish Civil War. He was a fascist, he was an authoritarian. Now, he wasn't doing death camps, but he was certainly using violence to get what he wanted. And he stayed in power until the 1970s in Spain. So it's because he obviously went and attacked other countries and, you know, basically, lied to Neville Chamberlain at the Munich conference and things like that, that other countries had to get involved. Okay. Um, yeah. And the USSR and the Allied forces were going to come back and go for him after all that he had done after 1939. So it wasn't because people inside Germany were necessarily upset or wanting a change. There were some, but internal domestic opposition was limited. Okay. So, in this sense, the book says authoritarian control of Germany by the Nazis can be seen to have been effective in limiting domestic opposition to the regime. Okay. Not all Germans believed every part of Nazi policy, but the number of denunciations received by the Gestapo showed a wide level of compliance with its aims of identifying enemies of the Reich. Okay. So, in other words, people would, we say in English tattletale, they would tell on their neighbors, their relatives, their community members for doing things that were anti-Nazi or not being a good Nazi. Um, Even though they could have just kept quiet, right, and not said anything and not pointed out that person who did something wrong or didn't give the Nazi salute or told a bad joke or something that we've talked about. Okay. Um, Germans, among the best educated people of Western Europe, submitted to the regime for a variety of motives. So then it gives you some bullets. Why did the German people um, uh, go along with this for as many years as they did? Okay. Belief in the aims of the Nazis. Some people absolutely hook, line, and sinker, as we say, went for the Nazi ideas. And they believed wholeheartedly in what Hitler was saying and doing. So you're going to always have your fervent believers. Fear of consequences of disobedience. So that means that the people were afraid that if they didn't do what they were being told to do, that they would get punished, and that punishment could mean prison, a concentration camp, or death. Disillusionment with the previous democratic system, the Weimar Republic, and all that we've talked about with how that was handled after World War I, and antipathy toward the possible rise of the left. Okay, so this is a rise. We've seen a country very close to us become a communist country. Russia went from being Russia to the USSR in the 1920s, and there is a fear that that communism and that extreme left politics, socialism, communism, will come to Germany and take over. We don't want that. Who's going to stop that from happening? Hitler. We'll vote for Hitler. Fourth bullet, gratitude for the material benefits that the Nazis seem to offer their social and economic programs, which offered employment and upward mobility for those who accepted the NSDAP. So we talked about that. We talked about the like resort camps, marriage loans. If you went all in and said you were a good Nazi and behaved like a good Nazi, you would get a job and you could rise up through the ranks and you would get material benefits. And for some people, that was worth giving up these other things in their life, these other rights. And last, pride in Nazi foreign policy. Okay. Remember, we talked about when not Hitler, sorry, Mussolini invaded Abyssinia and how that gave him a real boost among Italians. Like, look, he's going out, he's making, Italian pride, even though a lot of other countries were like, you're a really powerful, white country with good technology. Why are you beating up on these poor black people in Africa? But the Italians didn't see it that way. They saw it as like, making being great Italians and expanding their empire and all this other stuff. And some of the people in Germany felt the same pride, um, where, he was just hitting everything right. The Rhineland, the Saar plebiscite, the overtaking, taking back the Sudetenland, of course, Anschluss with Austria in 1938. Everything was going his way, and people were like, he's really going out there and striking a blow for Germany and making Germany a great country again. And people are realizing that we Germans are one of the best people. And all that until 1939, at least, really swelled German pride. Okay. Um, And again, if you weren't one of the people that was, in those groups, beggars, homeless, physically handicapped, mentally handicapped, all those people that we just talked about, you weren't being persecuted or targeted, your life was pretty good, you know? Um, and so again, we've talked so many times about how if your life's good, you're not complaining, right? You're not looking for another way out or another idea. And for a lot of Germans who accepted the Nazis, um, it wasn't so bad. Now, they were sheltered a lot from what was really happening. And of course, once the war started, a lot of them ended up giving up a husband, an uncle, a brother, a cousin, died in the war, et cetera, et cetera. But even that is not seen as that terrible because that's like doing your duty and your patriotic duty to the country and of course Hitler. Um, okay, and so it says, the Nazis really were reversing the diktat. They were taking the TOV away. They were putting people back to work. They were improving the economy. So a lot of people bought into it. Then it talks about a speech he gave. Okay. And then the final paragraph says, those who did doubt the regime, okay, who did maybe think, I don't know if I like that idea. Wait, why is he saying that? Wait, my best friend is Jewish. Why do we hate them? I don't think that's true, blah, blah. Um, Seldom reacted due to the terroristic nature of the state, and instead entered what has been described as a form of internal exile, which is remaining silent and detached from any form of political discourse or overt resistance. So a lot of people just kind of tuned it out. They didn't want to talk about politics. They didn't want to know what was really going on. They just wanted to live their lives and take care of their kids and, eat a good meal every day. And people do that sometimes. They don't want to be confronted with the reality. There's a famous movie called The Matrix. It's like, do you want to live in the Matrix where everything's great? And you don't have to worry too much, or do you want to know what real life is and the red pill or the blue pill? I'll let you look into that and watch the movie. You should watch that movie. Um, and for a lot of Germans, they just wanted to live in the Matrix. They didn't want to know what was really happening. Okay. Such compliance produced horrific results not only for the enemies of Nazi ideology, but ultimately for those who subsequently suffered the misery and destruction brought to Germany by a conflict that resulted in German deaths. And here's the big kicker, the partition of the nation in the aftermath of defeat. Okay, so what that last sentence means is, well, first of all, you have to remember that in World War One, part of the reason why people hated the TOV so much is that Germany was never invaded. The borders of Germany were never breached by the French forces, the Belgian, you know. So the Germans themselves didn't really kind of understand how much they were losing the war and why did we surrender? We haven't even, you know, nobody's even attacked us yet. Okay, in the same way that did not happen in World War One, it did happen in World War Two. Okay, um, they absolutely invaded Germany, and there was a race to Berlin between the Soviets, the communists, and the Americans on the other side. Who could get to Berlin first? Who could secure state secrets, the technology that the Germans were working on, like V2 rockets, the scientists that were trying to develop their own bombs and things. You know, the Americans had the Manhattan Project and developed the atomic bomb, but the Germans were working on things too, and they all wanted to get in on that. The Russian government and the American government. Because even though they were allies, they weren't really ideologically similar, right? Communism and democracy. And so what happened is after the war, there was an American section of Berlin, there was a Russian section, there was a French section, and a British section. And eventually, the Russian section was its own thing. And then the French, British, and American section kind of got put together, and there was a West Berlin and an East Berlin, and eventually there's a West Germany and an East Germany. And for many years, they were a very divided country. And there's a famous wall, the Berlin Wall, which you've probably heard of. And that all didn't really change until the late 1980s. So it stuck around for 40 years. And you know, they would go like to the Olympics and there would be the West German team and the East German team, almost like a North Korea and a South Korea, which we are familiar with nowadays. Okay, so this authoritarian control, a question could be to what extent, you know, they love that phrase. To what extent do you think authoritarian control was achieved in Nazi Germany? I would think you could write a persuasive essay saying it was achieved, that it was complete, and that Hitler had almost total control of the population for the entire time he was in charge. Okay, and so that's it. And then we have some exam style questions. All right. And I was telling, was it this book? Yeah. In here is a really good chart. So it's on page 233, and you can start to fill it out. Don't worry about Nasser. He's the guy from Egypt that we don't do. But there's Cuba, China, and Germany, and you should be able to fill in all these boxes. And then eventually, you know, if you put this like in your notebook and make some more space to write, you should be able to write what was a feature. So what was the ideology of the Nazis? What was the leadership? What were their economic aims? What were the parties that were allowed? Did they have a secret police force? And that way, when it's time to write a comparison essay between the two that you're going to pick, Mao as China and Hitler's Germany, or Cuba and Castro can be in there, that chart might help you. Okay, so that's it. We'll discuss the Holocaust in class. And we've now finished the Hitler section of this book. But of course, after the mocks, we have to we have to see how many days we have left before the real tests. And then we have to do China and Cuba still. Okay, so that's our big thing. questions, send them to me. But I said a name anyway. He sent me some good questions, but I didn't respond. I didn't reply. I mean, I replied, but I didn't give him answers because I said I'll just answer those in class so everybody can hear the answer. But if you have questions or things like that, just let me know. Okay, take care. See you soon. Peace.